Well, welcome to Sunday School on the Go from the First Baptist Church in Tallahassee. I'm Jim Glass, one of the teachers in the Pairs and Spares class, and it's my privilege to lead you through a brief overview of the history of Israel found in the books of 1st and 2nd Kings. On this third Sunday of June, the focal text for our lesson takes us to the tragic end of Solomon's reign. Although his political, military, and economic successes were unparalleled in their history, his moral and spiritual failures set in motion the end of the United Kingdom and the death of Israel as a nation. The lesson from today's study is one that has yet to be learned by any nation since that time, for we can easily see how his failure to lead in righteousness has been reflected so tragically in our own world today. We find this unfortunate record in 1 Kings chapter 11 and the first 13 verses. Well, surely it was a time of great rejoicing throughout Israel when the temple was dedicated, as we saw in chapter 8. The Ark of the Covenant finally rested in its proper place. The glory of the Lord filled the temple, and Solomon lifted his praise to God and his prayers for the people. Last week, we mentioned that chapter 8 of 1 Kings closed with those hopeful words. On the 8th day, Solomon sent the people away, and they blessed the king. Then they went to their tents joyful and glad of heart for all the goodness that the Lord had shown to David, his servant, and to Israel, his people. Our historian then proceeds to chapter 9, where we read, "When Solomon had finished building the temple of the Lord and the royal palace, and had achieved all that he had desired to do, the Lord appeared to him a second time, as he appeared to him at Gibeon. In this second meeting, the Lord said to him, 'I've heard the prayer and plea that you've made before me. I've consecrated this temple which you have built by putting my name there forever. My eyes and my heart will always be there.' God affirmed Solomon's prayer and promised that his presence would always be felt in the temple. Of this they could be certain. God would not go back on his promise to be with his people. But this also required that the Israelites and their new king heed the prayer that Solomon had lifted to the Lord. In verse 25 of his prayer recorded for us in chapter 8, Solomon had asked the Lord to keep for your servant David, my father, the promises you made to him when you said, 'You shall never fail to have a man to sit before me on the throne of Israel.'" But he didn't stop there. If God were to ensure that one of David's descendants would always sit on the throne of Israel, those descendants, beginning with Solomon himself, had to fulfill their obligations to God under the covenant. They had to follow God's law and walk in the ways of the Lord, even as David had walked. So in his prayer, Solomon asked that God would keep his promise, but he knew the access to God's blessings were dependent on their obedience. "If only your sons are careful in all they do to walk before me as David has done." The Lord repeated these conditions when he spoke to Solomon in chapter 9, when he said in verse 4, "As for you, if you walk before me in integrity of heart and uprightness, as David your father did, and do all I command and observe my decrees, my laws, I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever, as I promised David. But if you or your sons turn away from me and do not observe the commands and decrees I have given you and go off to serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land I have given them and will reject this temple I have consecrated for my name. Israel will then become a byword and an object of ridicule among all peoples. And though this temple is now imposing, all who pass by will be appalled and will scoff and say, 'Why has the Lord done such a thing to this land and to this temple?' People will answer, 'Because they have forsaken the Lord their God, who brought their fathers out of Egypt, and have embraced other gods, worshiping and serving them. That is why the Lord brought all this disaster on them.'" God made it perfectly clear to them, "I'll do my part. But if you reject me, I won't be obligated to protect you. In fact, I will have you removed from the land I have given you. I will reject this temple you have made for me as a place to dwell, and you will be ridiculed by the whole world because you turned away from the God who had delivered you from your bondage in Egypt and blessed you beyond measure." As firm and clear as that warning was, it didn't seem to have much of an impact on Solomon. Instead of asking for riches or the deaths of his enemies, Solomon had asked God to grant him wisdom, a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. God had not only given him what he asked for, but he also gave him what he didn't ask for, both riches and honor. The Lord also promised him long life. After all, if you have all the riches in the world, but no opportunity to enjoy them, what use are they? But this promise, as with the others we've read about in 1 Kings, had a conditional clause. The Lord said, "And if you walk in my ways and obey my statutes and commands, as David your father did, I will give you a long life." So in chapter 9, where the Lord acknowledged Solomon's prayer of the dedication of the temple, assured him of his promises, and warned Solomon about the consequences of failing to follow him, our historian fast forwards 20 years in Solomon's life to tell us how Solomon gave Hiram, the king of Tyre, 20 towns in Galilee because Hiram had given him the cedar lumber for the temple and his royal palace. Our historian also notes that Solomon enslaved all the Canaanites who remained in Israel. He also tells us that Solomon fulfilled his religious obligations 3 times a year. He offered sacrifices in the temple as required by the law of Moses. And he built sailing ships to bring gold back to Israel. Tucked in all these details, there is one small tidbit of information that you could easily pass over as you read the chapter. In verse 24, we read, "After Pharaoh's daughter had come up from the city of David to the palace Solomon had built for her, he constructed the supporting terraces." Now, we've already heard back in chapter 3 how Solomon took the Egyptian Pharaoh's daughter to be his wife very soon after he was crowned king. And we said that there was nothing in the Mosaic law that strictly prohibited this marriage. The Israelites were forbidden to marry any of the Canaanites whose land the Lord had given to them, but it doesn't say anything about marrying an Egyptian woman. Does that mean it was okay for Solomon to marry her? Well, let's read a little further. In chapter 10, we read of the visit of the Queen of Sheba, which must have been quite the event. In the rest of the chapter, our historian gives us a peek into the vast wealth and power Solomon accumulated during his reign. For example, in verse 21 we read, "All Solomon's goblets were gold, and all the household articles in the palace of the forest of Lebanon were pure gold." Nothing was made of silver because silver was considered of little value in Solomon's days. Verse 23, "King Solomon was greater in riches and wisdom than all the other kings of the earth. The whole world sought audience with Solomon to hear the wisdom God had put in his heart." Through it all, the writer of 1 Kings celebrates the riches and status of this mighty kingdom that had once been enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. Perhaps the greatest problem with riches and status is that people often forget how they got them. God had warned them of the enticing lure of prosperity and being like everybody else. Back in the days when the Israelites demanded a king, the prophet Samuel had a message from the Lord that we find in 1 Samuel chapter 8. "This is what the king who will reign over you will do. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his slaves. When that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen, and the Lord will not listen to you in that day." But the people refused to listen to Samuel. No, they said, we want a king over us. Then we will be like all the other nations. But an even greater warning was given to the people of Israel in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 17, beginning in verse 14. The Lord says, when you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, and have taken possession of it and settled it, and you say, let us set a king over us, like all the nations, be sure to appoint over you the king the Lord your God chooses. The king must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt to get more horses, for the Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way again. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. Although we typically point to Solomon's wives as the cause of his ultimate downfall, he had blatantly disobeyed all three of these specific instructions. 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 28 says, Solomon's horses were imported from Egypt. He took an Egyptian wife, along with 699 others and 300 concubines. He accumulated so much gold and silver that our historian tells us in verse 27 of chapter 10 that the king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stones. As effective as Solomon was at building a profitable and powerful empire, he was a miserable failure at following the Lord's instructions for him. He knew to do right, but he had utterly failed to do right in each of the ways the Lord had instructed him. Now, every once in a while, we see in 1 Kings a reference back to Egypt or the wilderness wanderings or one of the many other miraculous interventions of God on their behalf. As the proverb says, those who fail to learn from history are forced to repeat it. That's why Paul, after giving numerous examples from Israel's history like this one, told the followers of Christ in Corinth in the 11th chapter of his first letter to them in verse 10, these things happened to them as examples and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the fulfillment of the ages has come. Tragically, Solomon failed to learn from history. He forgot how his father David had walked with the Lord and how the Lord had blessed him. He forgot that the Lord told him his life would be blessed just like David's if you walk in my ways and obey my statutes and commands as David your father did. You shall never fail to have a man to sit before me on the throne of Israel if only your sons are careful in all they do to walk before me as David has done. If only may be the saddest words in all of Scripture. Solomon had been granted wisdom greater than anyone before him or since. Israel not only enjoyed peace from her neighbors, but the whole world came to Israel to hear the wisdom of Solomon. Yet Solomon failed to follow the Lord. If only he had listened and obeyed. The nation of Israel, like so many nations since, including our own, overflowed with wealth, power, and prestige. But there was something vital missing from the heart. Perhaps as you consider these words, you can hear the voice of the Lord Jesus asking the crowd, as recorded in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 8 and verse 36, what good is it for a man to gain the whole world, yet forfeit his soul? Because in chapter 11, our focal text for today, we read beginning in verse 1, now King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women, from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the people of Israel, you shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. Solomon clung to these in love. Now, in an age where polygamy was common, it was only natural that a king, in order to expand and secure his rule, would connect himself by marriage to the nations around him. Not only would this give Solomon cause to have many wives, but it was common for kings in that part of the world to have a large harem of women as his wives and consorts. In Solomon's case, most of these women were not Israelites, and each of them would have brought her religion and culture into the king's court to practice as she was accustomed to in her homeland. Not only were they allowed to practice their native religion, Solomon even went so far as to build temples for them, places of worship where the rites and rituals of their religion were practiced no matter how immoral, wicked, or depraved they might be. Notice how our historian relates Solomon's failure. Now, King Solomon loved many foreign wives, along with the daughter of Pharaoh. Now, it seems clear in the mind of the writer that marrying the daughter of Pharaoh was the first step in a continuing march toward moral perversion and spiritual corruption. Great wisdom and an intellectual knowledge of God were not then and never are a defense against the foolishness of idolatry. Because idolatry has its roots in the heart and springs from sensual desires and the lust of the flesh, human wisdom and ability are no match for sins of the heart. The biblical account of Solomon's falling away from the Lord shows that it was due to the fact that he loved many foreign wives who turned his heart from Jehovah to their own gods in his old age. This falling away didn't take place suddenly, but gradually, as Solomon aged and perhaps became more tolerant of his wife's worship of foreign gods and less faithful to his own worship of Jehovah. He didn't completely renounce the worship of the Lord. He did, as we saw earlier, offer the required sacrifices 3 times a year, but it's clear that his heart was no longer thoroughly devoted to the Lord, and he allowed the worship of Jehovah to take place alongside the worship of the false gods of the nations around him. And it all started with marrying the daughter of Pharaoh. There were others as well. First listed by our historian were the Moabites. The Moabites lived east of the Dead Sea in what is now Jordan. They were descendants of Moab, the son of Lot and his eldest daughter. On their journey to the Promised Land, the Israelites didn't pass through Moab, but went through the wilderness to the east. The Moabites were afraid of the Israelites, and their king, Balak, sought help from the Midianites. It was then that Balaam visited Balak and came up with a plan to try to stop the Israelites' advance. As a result, the Lord commanded the Israelites in Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 3, "No Ammonite or Moabite or any of his descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord, even down to the 10th generation," where the phrase "to the 10th generation" may have been the same as saying forever. After the conquest of the Promised Land, the Moabites remained hostile to the Israelites, and armed battles were not uncommon. David defeated the Moabites during his reign, but in time, the Moabites regained some of their former power and prosperity to the point that Sanballat, a Moabite, took a primary role in trying to prevent the rebuilding of Jerusalem in Nehemiah's day. Like the Moabites, the Ammonites lived on the east side of the Jordan River, north of the Dead Sea. The Ammonites were descended from Ben-Ami, the child produced by Lot and his youngest daughter, and their history follows that of the Moabites quite closely. They were also prohibited from entering the congregation of the Lord to the 10th generation, and afterwards they became very hostile to Israel, so much so that several of the Old Testament prophets pronounced fearful judgments against them. They were defeated by Saul and again by David, but one of Solomon's first wives was an Ammonite, and she was the mother of Rehoboam, who would become king after Solomon's death. The writer of the book of Kings next lists the Edomites. Now, the Edomites were the descendants of Esau, the brother of Jacob, and they lived between the Dead Sea and the Gulf of Aqaba. Although the Edomites were closely related to the Israelites, Saul and David both fought against them. And following our focal text here in chapter 11, we read of a survivor of those battles who gained the favor of the Egyptian Pharaoh in his attempt to cause trouble for Solomon and the Israelites. The Sidonians were the inhabitants of ancient Sidon, an influential, wealthy seaport on the Mediterranean Sea north of Israel in what is today modern Lebanon. It was from nearby Tyre that Solomon received the cedar he had used for his royal palace and the temple. Sidon was also the home of Jezebel, the infamous wife of King Ahab of Israel, who himself became a worshiper of the god Baal. Last in this list are the Hittites. The Hittites lived between the Euphrates River and Damascus. They were fierce rivals of the Egyptian and Assyrian empires. In the book of Joshua, they always appear as the dominant people group north of Galilee. Uriah, one of David's chief officers and the husband of Bathsheba, was a Hittite. It's possible, therefore, that Bathsheba may have been familiar with and even favorable to the worship of the Hittite gods. But God had been crystal clear about his intentions for the Israelites regarding marriage to the Canaanites. In Exodus chapter 34, verse 15, he told them, "Be careful not to make a treaty with those who live in the land, for when they prostitute themselves to their gods and sacrifice to them, they will invite you, and you will eat their sacrifices. And when you choose some of their daughters as wives for your sons, and those daughters prostitute themselves to their gods, they will lead your sons to do the same." The prohibition is made explicit in Deuteronomy chapter 7. When the Lord your God brings you into the land you are entering to possess and drives out before you many nations, the Hittites, the Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, 7 nations larger and stronger than you. And when the Lord your God has delivered them over to you and you have defeated them, then you must destroy them totally. Make no treaty with them and show them no mercy. Do not intermarry with them. Do not give your daughters to their sons or take their daughters for your sons, for they will turn your sons away from following me to serve other gods, and the Lord's anger will burn against you and will quickly destroy you. For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you out of all the peoples of the face of the earth to be his people, his treasured possession. In spite of the fact that God had made it abundantly clear to Solomon and to every Israelite that they were to be a people set apart for his purposes according to his will for them, both the king and the people rejected God's will. The Lord had said to the people of Israel, "You shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods." Solomon clung to these in love. One commentator writes that his love for his foreign wives was the rock on which living faith and true adherence to the Lord would at last suffer shipwreck. The Lord himself had promised and had given Solomon wisdom, riches, and glory above all other kings for the glorification of his kingdom, and these gifts of God merely contributed to estrange his heart from the true God for the simple reason, he says, that Solomon forgot the commandments of the Lord and suffered himself to be overcome by the lusts of the flesh, not only in loving many foreign wives, but so also as taking to himself wives from the nations with which Israel was not to enter into any close relationship whatsoever. In verse 3, we find that Solomon had 700 wives who were princesses and 300 concubines. One commentator explains, as he exceeded other kings in glory, wisdom, and power, so must he excel them not only in armies, chariots, and horses, but also in the number of his wives. It's clear, therefore, that the lust of the eye and the pride of life had their part in this huge establishment. Perhaps before his death, Solomon realized the depth of his disobedience and stupidity. For in Proverbs chapter 31, verse 2, we read, "O my son, do not spend your strength on women, your vigor on those who ruin kings." Yet Solomon had done just that. Surely spent his physical strength and vigor, but also wasted his spiritual vitality on those women who had ruined him as a king. For verse 3 ends with the words, "And his wives turned away his heart." How did their turning away of his heart affect him? Verse 4. "For when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father." Since Solomon was 60 years old when he died, this turning away of his heart must have begun not long after the dedication of the temple, possibly even before he became king when he married an Ammonite woman, contrary to God's law, then soon married the Pharaoh's daughter. We could easily imagine how Solomon, trying to balance the needs of his kingdom and the demands of 700 wives and 300 concubines and all their attendants, found it simpler to give in to their charms and appeals. As a result, Solomon's faith faltered. His heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. Although we don't read that he actually rejected Jehovah in favor of false gods, as other kings would later do, he apparently did more than simply allow his wives to worship at the shrines of their gods, shrines that he had caused to be built for them. He still offered sacrifices at the 3 Jewish feasts every year as the Lord required, but his heart was not in it. The shrines that he built remained until the time of King Josiah. If Solomon had ever repented and abandoned his idolatry, surely he would not have left these idolatrous temples standing. How bad was his apostasy and his idolatry? Verse 5. "For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. So Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and did not wholly follow the Lord as David his father had done. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Moloch, the abomination of the Ammonites, on the mountain east of Jerusalem. And so he did for all his foreign wives, who made offerings and sacrificed to their gods." Now, Ashtoreth was the moon goddess of the people of Sidon and their principal female deity. She was frequently associated with Baal, the sun god, who was their chief male deity. She was one of the great gods of the Assyrians, and the Greeks called her Astarte. Jezebel's 400 priests were probably employed in the service of Ashtoreth. In 2 Kings chapter 23, she is called the vile goddess of the Sidonians because of the sexual immorality that was part of their worship. Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites, is also known as Moloch, as we read later in this section of Scripture. As part of their worship of this false god, the Ammonites would offer their children as sacrifices, causing them to pass through the fire, meaning that they were burned alive to honor this idol, as we read in 2 Chronicles chapter 28 and Jeremiah chapter 7. One tradition says that the statue of Moloch was made of brass with hands so arranged that the child was placed in the hands as a fire burned below at the feet of the idol. Such acts were soundly condemned by the Lord in Leviticus chapter 20. Any Israelite or any alien living in Israel who gives any of his children to Moloch must be put to death. The people of the community are to stone him. Now, in the middle of this testimony from our historian about how Solomon went after these other gods, he stops as if to evaluate Solomon's failure. So Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not wholly follow the Lord, as David his father had done. The phrase, "he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord," is the worst possible incriminating statement that could be made about any king of Israel, and yet Solomon was guilty of this very thing by going after Ashtoreth and Milcom. But there's more to our historian's testimony of Solomon's sin. Although we don't know much about Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, we do know that worship to this idol included child sacrifice, as we find in 2 Kings chapter 3, verse 27, where the Moabite king sacrificed his oldest son when he saw they were losing a battle. the mountain which is east of Jerusalem, on which Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable idol of Moab, is none other than what we know of as the Mount of Olives. Our historian concludes in verse 8, and so he did for all his foreign wives, who made offerings and sacrificed to their gods. Although many biblical scholars try to minimize Solomon's guilt and complicity in idolatry, it's clear that he both permitted and encouraged it. This conclusion should be clear to us, that by his increasing tolerance and depraved compliance, Solomon brought ruin and destruction upon himself and his people for centuries to come. One commentator reminds us that all indulgence, which is grounded upon indifference to truth or founded upon lukewarmness, is not virtue, but a heavy sin before God, regardless of how it may resemble freedom and enlightenment. Perhaps there is no greater warning for us today. Alexander Maclaren adds an important note here when he writes, "So there, on Olivet's southern ridge, right opposite the temple, stood the three altars, and there the king worshipped. And if he did, he would have a crowd of imitators. The lessons of such a fall are many. First, he says, it teaches the destructive effect of yielding to sensual indulgence. Solomon's unbridled and monstrous polygamy sapped his manhood and his principle, darkened his clear spirit, blinded his keen eye, and turned a youth of noble aspiration and a manhood of noble accomplishment into an old age without dignity, reverence, or calm. All his wisdom was worth little if it could not keep him master of himself. A young man who lets his passions run away with him is less to be condemned than an old sensualist. God intends that our reason should govern our impulses and desires, and that conscience should govern all and be governed by His will. The vessel is sure to be wrecked when the officers are sent below and the mutineers get hold of the helm. Second, he says, it warns us that till the very end of life, a fall is possible. This ship went down when the voyage was nearly over. In sight of port it struck, and not for want of beacons. What pathetic warning lies in that phrase, when Solomon was old. After so many years of high aims, so many temptations overcome, with such habits of wisdom and kingly nobility, after such prayers and visions, he fell. And if he fell, who of us can be sure of standing? No length of life spent in holy thoughts and service secures us against the possibility of disastrous fall. Third, may we not venture to see a warning here against marriages in which there is not unity in the deepest things and a common faith? When you run in double harness, take a good look at the other horse. If a young Christian man or woman enters into such a union with one who is not a Christian, it's a great deal more probable that in the end there will be two unbelievers than that there will be two Christians. Finally, he says, we have nothing to do with pronouncing on Solomon's final condition, but he stands on the page of this history, a sad, enigmatical figure, a warning to all young people to take heed that the corrosion of the world does not rub off the bloom of early religion or make them cynically ashamed of the unselfishness of their early desires. There is no sadder sight than an old man whose youthful enthusiasm for goodness and belief in the super excellency of wisdom have withered, leaving him a hard worldling or a gross sensualist. Better the early days, when he was obscure and poor and believed in wisdom and in the God of wisdom, than the late ones, when worldly success has spoiled him. So we shouldn't be surprised by what we find in verse 9. Now the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart was turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice and had commanded him concerning this thing that he should not go after other gods, but he did not observe what the Lord had commanded. You have to ask, Was this really the same Solomon who had prayed at the dedication of the temple saying, "Praise be to the Lord who has given rest to his people Israel, just as he promised. Not one word has failed of all the good promises he gave through his servant Moses. May the Lord our God be with us as he was with our fathers. May he never leave us nor forsake us. May he turn our hearts to him, to walk in all his ways and to keep the commands, decrees, and regulations he gave our fathers. And may these words of mine, which I have prayed before the Lord, be near to the Lord our God day and night, that he may uphold the cause of his servant and the cause of his people Israel according to each day's need, so that all the peoples of the earth may know that the Lord is God and that there is no other. But your hearts," he said, "must be fully committed to the Lord our God, to live by his decrees and obey his commands as at this time." Is this the same Solomon who prayed that prayer? God had kept all his promises to Solomon and the Israelites. He had selected them to be his chosen people. He had delivered them from the iron furnace of Egypt. How in the world could Solomon have turned against the Lord so completely? For the writer of the book of Kings, it seems to have begun with one little mistake. Marriage to the first wife who didn't share his faith in God. His first taste of the forbidden fruit that only intensified as he got older. And his heart was turned away after other gods. Twice before, the Lord had appeared to him. The first, to grant him whatever he asked for. And the second time in chapter 9, to warn him not to turn away from the Lord and thereby fail to observe the commands and decrees he had given him and go off to serve other gods and worship them. Yet that's exactly what he had done. Verse 10, he did not keep what the Lord commanded. The consequences were momentous and fateful. Verse 11, therefore the Lord said to Solomon, since this has been your practice, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes that I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and will give it to your servant. Yet for the sake of David your father, I will not do it in your days, but I will tear it out of the hand of your son. However, I will not tear away all the kingdom, but I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem that I have chosen. No more devastating sentence could have been pronounced against this king, who was known the world over for his wisdom. But his wisdom had not protected him from the sins of the flesh and desiring what the Lord had commanded him not to seek, let alone desire. Because his loyalties were divided between his worship of Jehovah and the things of the world that he would conclude in the book of Ecclesiastes were nothing but vanities and a chasing after the wind, he became the man of James chapter 1 verse 8, double-minded and unstable in all he does. As a result, God told Solomon that he was going to tear the kingdom from him and give it to his servant. That servant, as we'll see next week, was a man named Jeroboam. Still, for the sake of David, God would fulfill his promise to allow Solomon's son to retain part of the kingdom. That son was Rehoboam, and his behavior towards his people inspired a rebellion that resulted in the division of Israel into two kingdoms, north and south. This tragic story from the history of Israel should be a clear warning to us today. If we are to enjoy the blessings of life that God promises to those who love him with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength, we must walk in his commandments, not turning to the right or to the left, immediately repenting of our sins and waywardness at the first longing glance or thought, because these things happened to them as examples and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the fulfillment of the ages has come. Well, thank you for being a part of our brief survey of the stories of the kings of Israel and Judah and the enduring message they provide for us in our own day. As you consider your own relationship with the Lord, would you ask him to reveal to you those areas in your life that have caused you to turn your heart away from him? Had Solomon heeded his own advice in his prayer from last week's lesson in chapter 8, his life and the life of the entire nation would have been far, far different. Well, next week, we'll see how God executed his judgment against Solomon after his death in chapter 12, verses 6 through 19, and find what we should learn from this tragedy in the history of Israel. As always, it's still a good thing to do. Keep calm, trust in the Lord, and wash your hands. God bless you.